The night was colder than usual when Steve Harvey stood silently by the window of his hotel room in Dubai. The city lights glittered like diamonds scattered across the earth, but his heart felt strangely heavy, as if something unseen was pulling him toward a truth he had ignored his entire life. From the distance, he heard a sound, a call, a voice that wasn't meant for entertainment or applause, but for something eternal. It was the adhan, the Muslim call to prayer. It echoed through the air like a haunting melody, trembling through his chest. He didn't understand the words, but somehow he felt them. His eyes drifted toward the mosque across the street. A river of people moving quietly, peacefully, as if answering an invisible call from the sky itself. Men of all ages and colors stepped inside, leaving their shoes behind. There was no noise, no shouting, no competition, only submission. Steve had hosted hundreds of shows, met thousands of people, but never had he witnessed silence so powerful. The air itself seemed to bend with reverence. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the night. The wind brushed against his face, carrying the faint scent of sand and incense. He didn't know why he was walking there. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. When he reached the mosque courtyard, he stopped. Rows of men stood shoulder to shoulder facing one direction. No one cared about who was rich or poor, famous or forgotten. The call ended and a new sound began. Soft murmurs of verses recited in Arabic. The imam's voice was calm, deliberate, ancient. Then suddenly everyone bowed, hundreds of men lowering themselves in perfect unity, their foreheads touching the ground. The sound of movement, synchronized like waves of surrender, filled the air. Steve felt his throat tighten. He had been in churches where voices rose in song, laughter, and praise. But this was different. There was no performance, only humility. He stood frozen, watching as they rose again, bowed again, each motion carrying meaning beyond words. And then it hit him, the realization that these men weren't praying to something they wanted. They were praying for something they already knew existed. They weren't asking to be seen. They were acknowledging that they already were. He watched one old man, his back bent with age, his hands trembling slightly as he raised them in supplication. Tears glistened in his eyes. Beside him stood a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, mimicking his father's movements with innocent sincerity. Generations united in one rhythm of devotion. A soft wind passed through, carrying with it the faint whisper of verses. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. Steve closed his eyes. For a moment, everything disappeared. The fame, the wealth, the cameras, the noise of the world. There was only that sound echoing through the chambers of his soul. When the prayer ended, no one applauded. No one rushed away. Men greeted one another gently, smiling, embracing as if the world outside didn't matter. Some sat quietly, lips moving in silent remembrance. Others helped the elderly to stand, their gestures filled with respect. Steve turned away, his eyes burning with something he couldn't describe. He walked down the street aimlessly, the hum of city life returning slowly. Yet inside, something had shifted, something irreversible. He remembered how often he had spoken about success, about believing in oneself, about chasing dreams. But tonight, he saw something beyond all that, a life not centered on the self, but on submission. Not on rising above others, but bowing before the one above all. Later, back in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. The images replayed endlessly, rows of bowed heads, the sound of whispered prayers, the unity of strangers before God. He wondered if peace could be so simple, if truth could be found not in answers, but in surrender. He reached for the Quran that had been gifted to him earlier that week. Its cover felt cool, smooth beneath his fingers. He opened it randomly and began to read the translation. The words were like gentle waves washing over wounds he didn't know he had. Verses spoke of mercy, patience, forgiveness, of a creator who was closer than one's jugular vein. Tears welled in his eyes. He thought of his mother, how she'd always prayed for him to find God's path, no matter what form it took. He thought of all the moments he had laughed at faith, mocked religion as old-fashioned. Now here he was alone, trembling, feeling smaller than he ever had, yet more alive than ever before. He whispered softly to himself, God, I don't know what you're trying to show me, but I feel it. The clock ticked quietly in the background. Outside, another adhan began, the call for the dawn prayer. The city was still dark, but its heart was awake. Steve stood up, walked back to the window, and watched as the streets came alive again with men heading to the mosque. Ordinary men, some in suits, others in work clothes, all united in that same simple purpose. For the first time, he didn't see them as strangers. He saw them as seekers, men walking towards something he too had begun to feel. He whispered again, this time more certain, maybe this is what peace looks like. The night faded into morning, and Steve Harvey stood silently, hands pressed against the glass, watching as the first rays of sunlight kissed the domes of the mosques. Somewhere deep inside, the seed of understanding had been planted. It would take time, but faith, like dawn, always found its way through darkness. And though he didn't say it out loud, he knew the truth. Something in him had begun to pray too. The morning light poured into the room like liquid gold, washing over Steve's face as he stood still by the window. The world outside had already awakened. Cars moved, people hurried, the city hummed its usual rhythm. But inside, silence clung to him. He hadn't moved for what felt like hours. The call to prayer still echoed faintly in his ears, looping endlessly like a melody he couldn't unhear. He ran his hand over his face, eyes red from sleeplessness. He felt hollow, yet full, like something inside him had been emptied out to make space for something new, something vast and unfamiliar. He didn't know what to call it. Peace, confusion, awakening. The Quran still lay open on the table. The verses stared back at him, unblinking. Every time he tried to close it, his hand hesitated. It felt wrong to shut it. Those words didn't just feel written. They felt alive. He sat down, elbows on his knees, and whispered to himself, "What are you doing to me?" He'd spent a lifetime believing he had control over his words, his career, his destiny. But last night, he had seen control dissolve into something greater. It was like watching the universe breathe. His phone buzzed, messages, reminders, flight details. The world calling him back. But he ignored it. He wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Something was calling him deeper. Later that afternoon, Steve stepped out into the sun again. The desert air burned softly against his skin, carrying the scent of dust and jasmine. He walked without direction through narrow streets lined with old buildings. Children played with worn-out footballs, their laughter echoing off the stone. Men with weathered faces sat outside small shops, sipping tea, talking quietly. Everywhere he looked, he saw life, but a different kind, not the loud, frantic, restless kind he knew. This life was humble. It moved slowly, purposefully, as though each moment mattered. He found himself standing in front of another mosque, smaller this time, modest, tucked between two old markets. A soft breeze lifted the sound of recitation from inside. Without thinking, he stepped closer. The door was open. Inside, the cool air smelled of stone and prayer mats. A few men sat reading, one sweeping the floor. An older man looked up and smiled at Steve, a warm, genuine smile, the kind that made you feel seen without being judged. "You are welcome, brother," the man said gently. His accent was thick, but his words were clear. "You are here to pray." Steve hesitated. "No, I just wanted to look." The man nodded with understanding, as though he had seen that kind of confusion 1,000 times before. "Look as much as you want. This house is open for all hearts that seek." Steve walked inside, removing his shoes, feeling the cool marble under his feet. He looked around, simple walls, faint light, and a peace so heavy it felt like a presence. He found a corner and sat down, watching as the old man continued sweeping, his lips moving in remembrance of God. After a while, the man sat beside him. "You are not Muslim?" he asked kindly. Steve shook his head. "No, I'm just curious." The man smiled again. "Curiosity is the first door. God brings whom he wills." They sat in silence for a long time. Steve's eyes wandered to the prayer rug in front of them, the marks of countless foreheads pressed into its fabric over the years. Then the old man spoke again, his voice low and measured. "You see, when we bow, we do not lose ourselves. We find ourselves. The world teaches surrender, and in surrender the soul breathes." Steve listened carefully, every word sinking into him like water into dry earth. The man continued sweeping after that, humming softly, leaving Steve alone with his thoughts. He didn't know how long he stayed there, only that when he finally stood up to leave, something inside him had grown heavier and lighter at the same time. Outside, the sky began to turn amber. The sun was setting behind the city's skyline, and once again the adhan began. That voice, that same haunting beauty that seemed to touch something ancient within him. He stopped walking, closed his eyes, and listened. That night, back in his hotel room, he called his wife. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Baby," He said softly, I saw something today, something I can't explain. She laughed gently. You always see something, Steve. You're a storyteller. He was silent for a moment. No, this time this was different. He told her about the men praying the peace, the old man's words. His wife listened quietly. You think God's trying to tell you something? She asked. I don't know, he whispered. But if he is, I'm listening. That night, he didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone. He opened the Quran again, this time deliberately. He read slowly, each verse like a mirror reflecting back everything he had ignored in himself. When he came to the verse that said, verily in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest, he broke down. He couldn't hold it anymore. He wept, not the kind of tears that come from sadness, but from release. The following day, something strange began to happen. Wherever he went, he saw prayer. In the airport, a janitor praying quietly in a corner. In a park, a man spreading his jacket on the ground to pray as the world rushed by. In every place, in every heart, that same rhythm, that same surrender. And every time he saw it, he felt that pull, a whisper inside him saying, you know what this is? One evening after returning from a meeting, he stood in the elevator, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. Next to him stood a young man holding prayer beads. The man smiled politely. You are American, he asked. Steve nodded. Yeah, you are visiting? Yeah. Just trying to understand this place. The man's smile grew softer. You will not understand it with your eyes, he said. You must understand it with your heart. When Steve looked at him, there was something in the man's eyes, a stillness, a certainty that was almost unsettling, as if he had already found what Steve was still searching for. That night, Steve couldn't sleep again. He tossed and turned, restless. His thoughts raced like storm clouds. He grabbed the Quran once more, flipping it open randomly. His eyes fell on another verse, and he found you lost and guided you. His breath caught in his throat. It felt like those words had been written off for him. He closed the book, placed his hand over it, and whispered, if you're calling me, I'm here. Days passed. He started visiting the mosque more often. He didn't go to pray, just to sit, to watch, to listen, to feel. Sometimes people would greet him kindly, invite him for tea, speak to him about faith without pressure or expectation. He admired that. They didn't try to sell him religion. They simply outlived it. He noticed how they smiled even when life seemed hard, how they gave without fear of losing, how they bowed not to people but to principle. And slowly something inside him began to change. The laughter he once used to fill silence now seemed shallow. The noise of fame, it all began to sound distant, meaningless. He had tasted something purer, something that made every other joy feel temporary. One Friday afternoon, he decided to attend the congregational prayer. He stood quietly at the back of the mosque as the imam began to speak in English, his sermon echoing through the hall. He spoke about gratitude, about the fleeting nature of life, about the moment every soul would stand before its creator alone. Steve's heart thumped. His hands grew cold. The imam's words cut deep. When you stand before God, the imam said, you will not be asked how many people knew your name. You will be asked who you were when no one was watching. The words struck him like lightning. He could feel them reverberate in his chest. For a moment, he wasn't Steve Harvey, the celebrity. He wasn't the host, the comedian, the success story. He was just a man, a soul standing before a mirror of truth. When the call to stand for prayer was made, he didn't move. He watched again, rows forming, shoulders touching, hearts aligned. And then something inside him broke. He stepped forward, one step, then another. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He stood at the end of a row, eyes lowered, heart pounding. The imam's voice rose. Allahu Akbar. The prayer began. He didn't know the words, didn't understand the motions. But when they bowed, he bowed. When they prostrated, he did too. And as his forehead touched the ground, something inside him shattered completely. It was as if every wound, every doubt, every regret poured out of him into that floor. For the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. He wasn't speaking. He was silent, truly silent, before something infinitely greater than himself. When the prayer ended, he stayed there, face still pressed against the ground. He didn't want to get up. He didn't want to lose that feeling, that stillness that felt like truth. When he finally did rise, his eyes were wet. No one stared at him. No one asked him why he was there. They simply smiled, shook his hand, and said, "Peace be upon you." He walked out into the evening light, the sound of the final supplications fading behind him. The air felt different, heavier, cleaner. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew he would never be the same again. That night, he called his wife again. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I prayed today," he said quietly. There was a long silence on the line. Then her voice, gentle, trembling. "How did it feel?" He laughed softly through tears. "Like I finally stopped running." The following weeks became a blur of reflection. He met scholars, imams, ordinary people who shared their stories of faith. He listened more than he spoke. Every conversation peeled away another layer of the life he thought he understood. He realized faith wasn't about perfection. It was about direction, about turning towards something even when the world pulled you away. One evening, after a long walk by the marina, he sat by the water staring at the reflection of the moon. The city lights shimmered like stars fallen into the ocean. He whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what I was searching for all along." He thought about all the times he had preached hope and perseverance on his shows, about the advice he'd given. And believe in yourself, trust your power, chase your dreams. But now it all seemed incomplete. What if true strength came not from believing in yourself, but believing in the one who made you? He picked up his phone and began typing a note, words that came from somewhere deeper than his mind. "There's a peace I found that no success ever gave me. It came when I bowed my head, not when I lifted my name." He didn't post it. Not yet. It wasn't time, but he knew. The journey had begun. In the quiet of that night, Steve Harvey sat watching the moon drift higher, his reflection shimmering on the surface of the water. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered softly the same words that had haunted him since that first add-on, Ve Allahu Akbar. And this time, he didn't just hear it, he believed it.